my family, drugged my food, to keep me quiet until my lawyer made them quiet with lawsuits. They say blood is thicker than water, but what happens when that blood turns poison? What happens when the people who are supposed to protect you become the very ones you need protection from? My name is Sandra Coleman, but everyone calls me Sandy, and I'm 74 years old. For the past 8 months, I lived in a fog so thick I thought I was losing my mind. But I wasn't losing my mind at all. I was being stolen from it, piece by piece, meal by meal, by the people I trusted most in this world. This is my story of betrayal, survival, and the moment I realized that sometimes the strongest weapon an old woman has isn't her voice. It's her silence while she plans her revenge. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I used to pride myself on having a sharp mind. For 43 years, I taught 5th grade at Riverside Elementary. And let me tell you, managing a classroom of 11-year-olds requires mental agility that would make a chess master weep. I could remember every student's name, their parents, occupations, their learning disabilities, their favorite subjects, and which ones needed extra attention during spelling tests. My colleagues used to joke that I had a steel trap for a memory, and honestly, they weren't wrong. That's why what started happening to me last spring felt like watching my own life slip through my fingers like water. It began with small things. I'd walk into my kitchen and forget why I'd come there. I'd start sentences and lose track of what I was saying halfway through. At first, I laughed it off. After all, I'm 74 years old and everyone expects a little forgetfulness at my age. My daughter Lisa would smile that patient smile and say, "Oh, Mom, that's just part of getting older." My son Robert would nod along, adding something about how we all have senior moments. But these weren't senior moments. These were gaps in my existence that felt like someone had taken an eraser to my consciousness. The dizzy spells started in May. I'd be sitting in my favorite armchair, the blue velvet one that my late husband Frank bought me for our 20th anniversary, and suddenly the room would tilt sideways like I was on a ship in rough seas. The first time it happened, I gripped the armrests so hard my knuckles went white. I thought I was having a stroke. "Mom, you look pale," Lisa said during one of her increasingly frequent visits. She'd started coming by every other day, always, with a casserole or a container of soup, always with that concerned expression that made me feel like a child who'd scraped her knee. "Have you been eating enough?" I had been eating. In fact, I'd been eating better than I had in months, thanks to all the food Lisa and Robert kept bringing over. Homemade chicken and dumplings, beef stew, meatloaf with mashed potatoes, all the comfort foods I'd taught them to make when they were teenagers. But instead of feeling nourished, I felt increasingly foggy, like I was living my life through a thick pane of glass. "Maybe you should see Dr. Peterson again," Robert suggested. He'd driven over from his house across town, something he'd never done regularly before but had started doing several times a week. You know, just to be safe. I had seen Dr. Peterson. Twice, actually. He'd run blood tests, checked my blood pressure, asked about my medications. Everything came back normal. "Probably just the stress of adjusting to retirement," he'd said, with the kind of dismissive smile that doctors give to elderly women when they can't find anything obviously wrong. "Try to stay active, keep your mind engaged." But I was active. I volunteered at the library on Tuesdays, tended my garden every morning, played bridge with my friends on Fridays. At least I had been doing those things until the episodes got worse. The first time I lost an entire afternoon, I was terrified. I remember eating lunch. I remember Lisa stopping by with a container of her famous chicken pot pie, the one with the flaky crust that had won first place at the county fair 3 years running. I remember her heating it up for me, insisting I eat while it was warm. I remember taking the first few bites and complimenting her on the seasoning. The next thing I knew, it was nearly 6 o'clock in the evening, and I was sitting in my living room with the television on, watching the news. But I had no memory of the afternoon. None at all. It was like someone had pressed a pause button on my life for 5 hours. When I called Lisa in a panic, she was surprisingly calm. "Mom, you probably just took a long nap. You've been tired lately." "But I don't remember going to sleep," I insisted. "I don't remember anything after lunch." "Memory can be tricky when you're exhausted," she said in that soothing voice she used when her own children were upset. "I'm sure it's nothing to worry about." But I was worried. I was terrified, actually. I'd worked with enough students over the years to know the difference between normal forgetfulness and something more serious. This wasn't misplacing my keys or forgetting someone's name. This was losing chunks of my life. The episodes became more frequent after that. Always after meals. Always after eating something Lisa or Robert had brought me. I started keeping a journal, writing down everything I could remember, trying to find patterns. What I found made my blood run cold. Every time I lost time, there were documents on my kitchen table that I didn't remember looking at. Bank statements with my signature on withdrawal slips I didn't remember signing. Insurance forms with my name neatly written in handwriting that looked like mine, but felt foreign. A power of attorney document that made Lisa my legal guardian in case of incapacitation. "When did I sign this?" I asked Lisa one afternoon, holding up the power of attorney paperwork with shaking hands. She looked genuinely surprised, which should have been reassuring, but somehow wasn't. "Don't you remember? We went over it last week when you were having one of your confused spells. You said you wanted to make sure everything was in order, just in case." I didn't remember saying that. I didn't remember any conversation about power of attorney. But there was my signature, clear as day, right next to the date from the previous Wednesday. That night, I called my oldest friend, Margaret Howell. We'd known each other since we were both young teachers, fresh out of college and full of idealism about changing the world one student at a time. If anyone would give me honest advice, it would be Maggie. "Sandy dear, you sound frightened," she said after I'd explained what had been happening. "I am frightened, Maggie. I feel like I'm disappearing piece by piece and I don't understand why." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Maggie spoke again, her voice was careful, measured. "Have you considered that maybe the stress of living alone is affecting you more than you realize? Lisa and Robert are just trying to help." Even Maggie was dismissing my concerns. I hung up feeling more isolated than I had since Frank died 3 years ago. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in July. I'd been having a particularly clear day, feeling more like myself than I had in weeks. I decided to drive to the bank to check on my accounts, something I'd been meaning to do but kept forgetting about. The balance in my checking account made me sit down hard in the plastic chair next to the teller's window. $43,000. 3 months ago, I'd had nearly $90,000 in that account, money I'd saved carefully from my pension and Frank's life insurance. "Excuse me," I said to the young teller, a girl who couldn't have been much older than my former students. "Can you show me the recent transactions on this account?" She printed out a statement that made my hands shake. Withdrawal after withdrawal, each one for several $1,000s, each one bearing my signature. The memo lines were filled with things like home repairs, medical expenses, and family loan. I hadn't made any of these withdrawals. I hadn't authorized any family loans. I hadn't had any major medical expenses or home repairs, but there was my signature on every single transaction. That evening, Lisa came by with dinner as usual. Lasagna this time, with garlic bread and a side salad. She bustled around my kitchen, with the familiarity of someone who'd been doing this routine for months, which I supposed she had. "You seem upset, Mom," she said as she set the plate in front of me. "Is everything okay?" I looked at my daughter, really looked at her. Lisa had always been the responsible one, the one who called every week, who remembered birthdays and anniversaries. She worked as a bookkeeper for a local accounting firm, had 2 teenage children, and had been struggling financially since her divorce 2 years ago. Robert, my younger child, had been laid off from his job at the manufacturing plant and was behind on his mortgage. Both of my children were under significant financial stress, and suddenly their elderly mother was having memory problems and signing documents she couldn't remember. The realization hit me like a physical blow. "I went to the bank today," I said quietly, watching Lisa's face carefully. Her expression didn't change, but I caught something in her eyes. A flicker of something that might have been panic before. She composed herself. "That's good, Mom. It's important to stay on top of your finances. $47,000 is missing from my checking account." Now her face did change. She looked concerned, motherly, exactly the way she should look if her elderly mother was making wild accusations. "Mom, that's impossible. Are you sure you're reading the statements correctly? Maybe you should let me take a look at your finances, help you organize everything. Sometimes when we're feeling confused, numbers can seem—" "I'm not confused about this, Lisa." My voice was stronger than it had been in months. "I want to know where my money went." She sat down across from me at the kitchen table, reaching over to pat my hand. "Mom, I think you're having another one of your episodes. You've been giving us money to help with expenses, remember? You insisted on it. You said you wanted to help your family while you still could." I pulled my hand away from hers. "I don't remember giving you any money." "You don't remember a lot of things lately," she said gently. "That's why Robert and I have been so worried. About you. That's why we think you might need more help than you're willing to admit." After she left that night, I sat in my living room until the sun came up, thinking. The lasagna sat untouched on my kitchen table. I was afraid to eat it. Afraid of what might happen if I did. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For the first time in months, my mind felt clear, sharp. Like the fog had lifted just enough for me to see the truth that had been hiding in plain sight. My children weren't helping me. They were stealing from me, systematically and deliberately, using my own trust against me. They were drugging my food to keep me compliant while they emptied my bank accounts and forged my signature on legal documents. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that I actually felt physical pain in my chest. These were the babies I'd rocked to sleep, the toddlers I'd taught to walk, the teenagers I'd worried about when they stayed out past curfew. I'd worked 2 jobs to pay for Lisa's college education. I'd co-signed Robert's first car loan when he was barely 18, and now they were slowly, methodically destroying me. But as I sat there in the early morning light, something else began to grow alongside the pain. Anger. Pure, clean, righteous anger that burned away the last of the fog in my mind. They thought I was a helpless old woman who would quietly fade away while they picked my bones clean. They thought I was too confused, too trusting, too weak to fight back. They were wrong. I may be 74 years old, but I was a teacher for over 4 decades. I know how to plan, how to gather evidence, how to build a case. I know how to be patient and methodical, and I know how to be very, very quiet while I figure out exactly how to make someone pay for underestimating me. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in months. I drove myself to the library and used their computer to research elder care attorneys. Then I drove to a different bank across town and opened a new account under my maiden name, transferring what was left of my savings before Lisa and Robert could steal that too. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like Sandra Coleman again. Not the confused, helpless victim my children had been creating, but the woman who had commanded respect in classrooms full of unruly children, who had stood up to demanding parents and difficult administrators, who had survived the death of her husband and built a life on her own terms. My children had made a critical error in their calculations. They assumed that making me weak would make me stupid. They assumed that stealing my money would steal my power. They were about to learn just how dangerous it is to underestimate a woman who has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. But first, I had to be smart about this. I had to play their game while building my own. I had to let them think they were winning while I gathered the evidence that would destroy them. The hardest part would be pretending to still be their victim while I planned their downfall. That afternoon, when Robert came by with a container of beef stew, I smiled and thanked him. When he insisted on watching me eat it, I took small bites and complimented his cooking. When the familiar drowsiness began to creep over me, I didn't fight it. But this time, I was ready. Hidden in my bedroom was a small digital recorder I'd bought at the electronics store. Tucked behind my kitchen curtain was a tiny camera that would capture everything that happened while I was unconscious. Let them think they had won. Let them think I was still their helpless, confused victim. While they were busy congratulating themselves on their cleverness, I would be building the case that would put them in prison where they belonged. After all, I'd been teaching lessons for 43 years. It was time to teach my children the most important lesson of their lives. Never underestimate your mother. The game was just beginning, and they had no idea they were playing against a woman who had been preparing for this fight her entire life. The next 3 weeks were the most challenging performance of my life. Every smile felt like swallowing glass. Every thank you burned my throat, and every time I pretended to be grateful for their help, a piece of my soul died. But I forced myself to play the role of the declining elderly mother while secretly documenting every single thing they did to me. The hidden camera I'd installed behind my kitchen curtain captured more than I ever expected. On the first day of recording, I watched Lisa arrive with her usual cheerful demeanor, carrying what appeared to be innocent homemade chicken soup. But before serving it to me, she pulled a small vial from her purse and carefully measured drops of clear liquid into the bowl, stirring it thoroughly before heating it in my microwave. My own daughter was poisoning me with the same hands that used to braid my hair when she was 7 years old. The audio recorder I'd hidden in my bedroom picked up conversations they had while they thought I was unconscious. Their voices were casual, businesslike, as if they were discussing grocery lists instead of my systematic destruction. The bank called about the latest withdrawal. Robert's voice came through clearly on the recording. They're starting to ask questions about the frequency. I told you we needed to space them out more, Lisa replied. But we're running out of time. The realtor says we can get at least $400,000 for the house, maybe more if we do some updates first. My house. They were planning to sell my house, the home Frank and I had built together 37 years ago, where I'd raised my children, where every room held memories that meant more to me than any amount of money. What about Mom? Robert asked. Shady Oaks has an opening in their memory care unit. I've already spoken with the director. With her condition deteriorating so rapidly, it's really the best option. She'll be safe there, and we won't have to worry about her getting confused and hurting herself. Shady Oaks. I knew about Shady Oaks. It was the nursing home where residents disappeared into themselves, warehoused until death while their families collected their Social Security checks. Mrs. Henderson from my bridge club had been placed there 2 years ago, and within 6 months, she'd forgotten her own name. They weren't just stealing my money. They were planning to steal my entire life, to erase Sandra Coleman completely and replace her with a confused shell who would sit quietly in a sterile room until she stopped breathing. The rage that filled me was so pure and hot that I had to bite my lip to keep from screaming, but I couldn't let them know I was aware. Not yet. I needed more evidence, more documentation, enough to ensure they would face serious prison time for what they'd done to me. I started keeping detailed written records of everything, hidden in a shoebox at the back of my bedroom closet. Times, dates, what they gave me to eat, how long I was unconscious afterward. What I discovered had been moved or signed while I was out. I photographed every document they'd forged, every bank statement showing unauthorized withdrawals, every piece of evidence of their systematic theft. The hardest part was maintaining my act when they were around. Lisa would stroke my hair and tell me how much she loved me while calculating how much my jewelry was worth. Robert would hug me and ask how I was feeling while mentally dividing up my possessions. The sheer depth of their deception was breathtaking in its cruelty. But I was learning things about my children that I'd never known. Things that made me question everything I thought I understood about the people I'd raised. During one of their conversations while I was supposedly unconscious, I discovered that Lisa had been stealing from her employer for months. Robert hadn't been laid off from his job at all. He'd been fired for showing up drunk repeatedly. Both of my children were deeper in debt than I'd imagined, with gambling problems, credit card bills, and lifestyle expenses they couldn't afford. They saw me as their salvation, their retirement plan, their ticket out of the financial hole they'd dug for themselves. And they were willing to destroy me completely to get what they wanted. The attorney I'd contacted, Maria Santos, was everything I'd hoped for and more. She was a specialist in elder abuse cases, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. When I showed up at her office with my shoebox full of evidence, she listened without interrupting, asking sharp questions that showed she understood exactly what my children were doing to me. "Mrs. Coleman," she said after reviewing my documentation, "what your children are doing constitutes multiple felonies: elder abuse, financial exploitation, fraud, conspiracy, and possibly attempted murder, depending on what substances they've been giving you." Attempted murder. The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd been thinking in terms of theft and betrayal, but Maria was right. They'd been systematically poisoning me, and if I hadn't figured it out when I did, they might have eventually given me too much of whatever they were using. I could have died, and it would have looked like natural causes in an elderly woman with documented cognitive decline. "The evidence you've gathered is excellent," Maria continued, "but we need more. We need to identify exactly what substance they're using, and we need irrefutable proof of their intent. Are you willing to continue this charade while we build an airtight case?" I thought about what she was asking. More weeks of pretending, more meals laced with drugs, more time lost to unconsciousness while my children ransacked my life. More conversations overheard while they planned my complete erasure. "How long?" I asked. "Another month? Maybe 6 weeks? Long enough to document a clear pattern and get the toxicology reports we need. I know it's asking a lot." It was asking everything. But the alternative was letting them get away with it, letting them continue to steal from other elderly people, letting them believe that vulnerable meant powerless. "I'll do it," I said. Maria arranged for a private laboratory to test samples of the food Lisa and Robert brought me. The results were horrifying. They'd been using a combination of benzodiazepines and sleep aids, carefully calibrated doses that would keep me compliant and confused without immediately killing me. The fact that they knew enough to measure the dosages suggested they'd researched. This planned it carefully. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. This was calculated, premeditated destruction. During this time, I also discovered that I wasn't their first victim. While pretending to be unconscious one afternoon, I overheard a phone conversation Robert was having with someone I didn't recognize. "It worked perfectly with our mother," he was saying. "She had no idea what was happening until it was too late. Yeah, the key is consistency and patience. You can't rush it or they get suspicious." He was giving advice to someone else about how to drug and rob an elderly parent. My son wasn't just a thief. He was teaching other people how to become thieves. The person he was talking to turned out to be his neighbor, whose 80-year-old father had recently started showing signs of confusion. Maria's team was able to trace the phone records and alert Adult Protective Services. We'd uncovered an entire network of adult children who were systematically abusing their elderly parents. As the evidence mounted, I began to understand that my situation was part of something much larger. Elder abuse was reaching epidemic proportions, with family members often being the primary perpetrators. What was happening to me was happening to thousands of other elderly people across the country. People who trusted their children and found that trust used as a weapon against them. But knowledge came with a price. The more I learned about the scope of their betrayal, the more isolated I felt. These weren't my children anymore. The Lisa who used to bring me dandelion bouquets when she was 5, the Robert who cried in my arms when his first dog died, those children were gone. In their place were strangers who looked like my babies but had hearts I didn't recognize. The loneliness was crushing. I couldn't talk to my friends about what was happening because I couldn't risk word getting back to Lisa and Robert. I couldn't trust anyone in my social circle because I didn't know who else might be reporting back to them. For all I knew, they'd been telling people for months that I was declining mentally, setting up the narrative that would excuse their actions. I was completely alone except for Maria and her team, and I had to continue living this nightmare performance while they built the case that would bring my children down. The breaking point came 6 weeks into my undercover operation. Lisa arrived at my house looking more stressed than I'd ever seen her. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, and there were dark circles under her eyes. "Mom, we need to talk," she said, sitting down at my kitchen table without her usual pretense of cheerfulness. "Of course, sweetheart," I replied, settling into my role as the confused but compliant mother. "Your bank called me today. They've been asking questions about your account activity, and I think they might be getting suspicious. We need to accelerate our timeline." My blood turned to ice. They were going to increase the frequency of their thefts, which meant increasing the frequency of drugging me. Maria had warned me that this might happen, that as their desperation grew, they might become more careless and more dangerous. "I don't understand, dear. What timeline?" Lisa looked at me with what might have been genuine sadness, which somehow made it worse. "Mom, your condition is getting worse. Robert and I have been talking, and we think it's time to start looking at care facilities. Somewhere safe where trained professionals can help you." "I don't want to leave my house," I said, letting genuine emotion creep into my voice. "I know, Mom, but you're not safe here alone. You forget things, you get confused, and we're worried about you. Shady Oaks has a beautiful memory care unit, and you'd have your own room with a view of the garden." She was so convincing, so caring in her tone, that if I hadn't known the truth, I might have believed she was genuinely concerned about my welfare. But I knew about the conversations she'd had with Robert about selling my house. I knew about the forged documents and the stolen money. I knew that her tears were crocodile tears, designed to manipulate me into cooperating with my own destruction. "When would this happen?" I asked. "Soon, Mom. Maybe next week. I know it's a big change, but it's really for the best." Next week. They were planning to have me committed to a memory care facility next week, probably after one final massive withdrawal from my accounts and the signing of papers that would give them complete control over my estate. That night, I called Maria in a panic. "They're moving faster than we expected," I told her. "They want to put me in a nursing home next week." "Are you ready to move forward with the arrests?" she asked. I thought about my children, about the babies I'd loved and the monsters they'd become. I thought about all the other elderly people who were suffering the same betrayal I was experiencing. I thought about the life I'd built and the future they were trying to steal from me. "Yes," I said. "I'm ready." Maria's plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would invite Lisa and Robert over for Sunday dinner, telling them I had something important to discuss about my future. While they were there, I would serve them food for once, instead of the other way around. But unlike them, I wouldn't be adding any secret ingredients to their meals. Instead, the house would be full of hidden recording equipment, and Maria would be listening from a van parked down the street. When Lisa and Robert inevitably tried to drug my food or pressure me into signing more documents, everything would be captured on audio and video. Then the police would move in. The hardest part was preparing the meal while maintaining my active decline. I had to cook like someone whose mental faculties were slipping, burning the edges of the roast slightly, oversalting the vegetables, making the kinds of mistakes that would reinforce their belief that I was becoming incompetent. As I cooked, I thought about all the Sunday dinners I'd prepared for my family over the years. Birthday celebrations, holiday gatherings, simple meals where we'd talked about our days and our dreams. My kitchen had been the heart of our home, the place where we'd shared our lives with each other. Now it was going to be the place where I finally exposed the people my children had become. When Lisa and Robert arrived that Sunday, they were clearly surprised that I'd cooked for them. They exchanged glances that I pretended not to notice, the kind of silent communication that siblings develop over years of shared conspiracy. "Mom, you didn't need to go to all this trouble," Lisa said, though I could see her mentally calculating what this meant for their plans. "I wanted to," I replied. "I have some things I want to discuss with both of you, and I thought we should have a nice family dinner first." We sat down at the dining room table, the same table where I'd helped them with homework, where we'd played board games on rainy Saturday afternoons, where Frank and I had told them about his cancer diagnosis 3 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me that this table, which had witnessed so many important family moments, was about to witness the end of our family as I'd known it. The conversation during dinner was surreal. Lisa and Robert talked about their lives, their jobs, their children, as if they weren't systematically destroying their own mother. They asked about my health, my activities, my plans for the future, all while knowing they intended to take my future away from me. But I played my part perfectly. I mentioned feeling confused lately, worried about my memory, concerned about living alone. I gave them every opening they needed to suggest that I needed more help, that I should consider signing papers that would make things easier for all of us. And they took the bait beautifully. "Mom," Robert said as I served dessert, "Lisa and I have been thinking about what you just said, about feeling confused and worried. Maybe this is a good time to talk about some practical matters." "What kind of practical matters?" I asked, though I knew exactly what was coming. Lisa reached into her purse and pulled out a stack of papers. "We've prepared some documents. That would help us take care of things for you if you ever need us to. Nothing major, just some basic authorization so we can help manage your affairs if you're not feeling up to it." I looked at the papers, recognizing several from my previous research. Updated power of attorney documents that would give them complete control over my finances. A healthcare directive that would let them make all medical decisions for me. A property transfer that would essentially sign my house over to them while allowing me to live there as long as I was able. "I don't know," I said, letting uncertainty creep into my voice. "These look complicated. Maybe I should have my lawyer look at them first." "Mom, these are just standard forms," Robert said smoothly. "We had them prepared by a lawyer already. And honestly, given how you've been feeling lately, it might be better to take care of this while you're having a good day mentally." The implication was clear. They were suggesting that I might not have many more good days mentally, that this might be my last chance to sign documents while I was still competent to do so. "I suppose that makes sense," I said, reaching for a pen. That's when Lisa made her fatal mistake. As I started to read through the first document, she got up from her chair and moved toward the kitchen. "I'm just going to get us some coffee to go with dessert, Mom," she said casually. But I could see her through the doorway, and she wasn't preparing coffee. She was pulling that familiar small vial from her purse, the same vial I'd seen her use dozens of times in my hidden camera footage. She was preparing to drug my dessert, to make me compliant and confused while they watched me sign away everything I owned. They couldn't even let me have one last clear-headed family dinner before they destroyed me. That's when I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was doing the right thing. These people weren't my children anymore. They were predators who happened to share my DNA, and they deserved everything that was about to happen to them. Actually, Lisa, I called out, my voice stronger and clearer than it had been in months. I don't think I need any coffee. She froze in the kitchen doorway, the vial still in her hand. And I don't think I need to sign any papers tonight either. That's when the front door opened, and Detective Morrison walked in with 3 uniformed officers behind him. Lisa Coleman and Robert Coleman, Detective Morrison said. You're under arrest for elder abuse, financial exploitation, fraud, and conspiracy. The look on their faces was something I'll remember for the rest of my life. Shock, confusion, disbelief, and then finally, the dawning realization that their helpless, confused mother had outsmarted them completely. As the handcuffs clicked around their wrists, Lisa looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't love, or even anger. It was pure hatred, the look of someone who'd been caught in the act and blamed their victim for fighting back. How long have you known? She asked. I looked at my daughter, this stranger who'd been stealing my life piece by piece, and felt nothing but pity for the person she'd chosen to become. Long enough, I said. As they were led away, Robert turned back to look at me one last time. Mom, we can explain everything. This is all a misunderstanding. Even caught red-handed, even with the evidence of their crimes spread out on my dining room table, they were still trying to manipulate me. They still thought I was the confused old woman they could lie to and deceive. The only misunderstanding, I told him, was mine. I misunderstood what kind of people I'd raised. After they were gone, I sat alone in my dining room surrounded by the wreckage of what had once been my family. The house felt different, quieter, but also cleaner somehow, as if a poison had finally been drawn out. Maria appeared at my door a few minutes later, having monitored the entire evening from her surveillance van. How do you feel? She asked. I thought about that question for a long time. How did I feel? Victorious? Vindicated? Relieved? All of those things, but also something else. I felt like Sandra Coleman again, not the victim they'd tried to create, not the confused old woman they'd needed me to be, but the person I'd always been underneath their manipulation. I felt like myself again, and that was worth more than all the money they'd stolen, more valuable than the house they'd tried to take, more precious than the life they'd almost destroyed. For the first time in 8 months, I was completely, genuinely free. The media circus that followed the arrests was something I could never have prepared for. Within 24 hours, news vans lined my quiet street, reporters knocked on my doctor at all hours, and my telephone rang constantly with calls from journalists wanting to hear about the heroic grandmother who caught her own children stealing from her. I hated every minute of it. This wasn't heroic to me. This was the most devastating failure of my life as a mother. Somewhere along the way, I had raised 2 human beings who were capable of systematically destroying their own parent for money. Every interview request, every sensational headline, every social media post calling me brave felt like salt in a wound that would never fully heal. The worst part was the way people talked about Lisa and Robert as if they were strangers who had somehow infiltrated my family. I can't believe your own children would do that to you, neighbors would say, shaking their heads in disbelief. But they were my children. I had shaped them, taught them, loved them into existence. Their capacity for cruelty didn't come from nowhere. Maria tried to shield me from the worst of the media attention, but there was no escaping the fact that my private family nightmare had become public entertainment. The story had everything the news cycle craved: elderly victim, shocking betrayal, dramatic arrest. The fact that I had turned the tables on my abusers made it even more compelling to audiences hungry for justice stories. But justice, I was learning, was far more complicated than I had imagined. The legal proceedings began almost immediately. Lisa and Robert were denied bail after the prosecutor argued they posed a flight risk and had demonstrated a pattern of targeting vulnerable elderly individuals. The evidence Maria and I had gathered was overwhelming. but the defense attorneys were already crafting narratives designed to minimize their crimes. Lisa's lawyer painted her as a desperate single mother overwhelmed by financial pressures and her mother's declining mental health. Robert's attorney claimed he was simply following his sister's lead, too trusting and naive to understand the full scope of what they were doing. Both defense teams hinted that they would argue their clients believed they were acting in my best interests, helping a confused elderly woman who was no longer capable of managing her own affairs. It was masterful victim blaming disguised as compassion, and it made me physically sick. The preliminary hearings were torture. I had to sit in a courtroom and listen to my children's lawyers describe me as a delusional old woman who had fabricated evidence against her loving children. They questioned my mental capacity, my memory, my ability to distinguish reality from paranoid fantasies. They suggested that I had somehow doctored the recordings, planted the evidence, and manipulated the bank records to frame innocent family members. Watching Lisa and Robert sit at the defense table in their modest clothes and humble expressions, playing the role of confused victims of their mentally declining mother, was almost more than I could bear. They looked so young, so vulnerable, so much like the children I remembered that several times I had to remind myself of what they had actually done to me. Their performances were flawless. Lisa dabbed at her eyes with tissues while her lawyer described her heartbreak at being accused of harming the mother she loved. Robert sat with his head bowed, the picture of remorse and confusion. To anyone who didn't know the truth, they looked like devoted children being railroaded by a vindictive parent with dementia. But the evidence spoke louder than their performances. The toxicology reports were damning. Hair samples taken from my brush showed consistent levels of benzodiazepines and sleep aids over a period of 6 months. The hidden camera footage clearly showed Lisa and Robert adulterating my food with substances from unmarked vials. The audio recordings captured their discussions about selling my house, accessing my accounts, and moving me to a memory care facility, against my will. Most damning of all were the financial records. Maria's forensic accountant had traced every stolen dollar, documented every forged signature, mapped out a pattern of theft that was methodical and deliberate. There was no way to explain away the evidence as the misunderstandings of a confused, elderly woman. But even with overwhelming proof of their crimes, the emotional toll of the legal process was devastating. Every court appearance forced me to relive the months of abuse, to articulate the depth of their betrayal, to explain how it felt to discover that the people I loved most in the world saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to their financial security. The hardest moments came when I had to testify about specific incidents. The prosecutor, a young woman named Jennifer Walsh, was thorough and compassionate, but she had to ask questions that cut to the bone. "Mrs. Coleman, can you describe what it felt like to wake up and find documents you didn't remember signing? Mrs. Coleman, when you realized your children were drugging your food, what went through your mind? Mrs. Coleman, did you ever consider that your children might seriously harm you to get access to your assets?" Each question forced me to examine not just what Lisa and Robert had done, but what I had failed to see, failed to prevent, failed to understand about the people I had raised. Every answer felt like admitting to a fundamental failure as a mother. The worst testimony came when I had to describe finding the power of attorney documents that would have given them complete control over my life. Jennifer Walsh had me read aloud from the papers, explaining what each section would have meant if I had signed them while under the influence of the drugs they were giving me. This clause would have given your children the authority to place you in any care facility they deemed appropriate regardless of your wishes. Is that your understanding? Yes. And this section would have transferred ownership of your home to your children, while allowing you to remain there only at their discretion. Is that correct? Yes. Mrs. Coleman, if you had signed these documents while impaired by the substances your children were giving you, what would have happened to your independence? I looked across the courtroom at Lisa and Robert, sitting with their lawyers, staring at me with expressions I couldn't read. They looked like strangers wearing my children's faces. I would have ceased to exist as an independent person, I said. I would have become their property, completely dependent on their mercy for every aspect of my life. The gallery was silent except for the scratching of reporters' pens and the quiet sobbing of someone in the back row. I later learned it was Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman from my neighborhood whose own son had been stealing from her for years. She had come to every hearing, drawing strength from watching someone else fight back against family abuse. But the defense wasn't finished with me. During cross-examination, Lisa's attorney, a silver-haired man named David Brennan, attempted to dismantle my credibility with surgical precision. Mrs. Coleman, you've admitted to deceiving my client for weeks, pretending to be confused and helpless while secretly recording her private conversations. Is that correct? I was gathering evidence of crimes being committed against me. So you lied to your daughter, someone who was concerned about your welfare and trying to help you? I protected myself from someone who was systematically poisoning and robbing me. But you've also admitted that you hid money from your children, opened secret bank accounts, and met with lawyers without telling them. These aren't the actions of someone who trusts her family, are they? Maria had prepared me for this line of questioning, but it was still infuriating. Brennan was trying to make my self-preservation look like evidence of mental instability and family dysfunction. Mr. Brennan, I said, looking directly at him, if someone was slowly poisoning you and stealing your life savings, would you tell them you knew about it before you had enough evidence to stop them? Mrs. Coleman, isn't it true that you've had conflicts with your children about money in the past? No, that's not true. Didn't you refuse to help your daughter Lisa with her divorce expenses 2 years ago? I felt a flash of anger. I offered to loan Lisa money for her legal fees. She refused my help and said she would handle it herself. And didn't you decline to co-sign a loan for your son Robert when he was facing financial difficulties? Robert never asked me to co-sign a loan. If he had, I would have considered it. Brennan was creating a false narrative, suggesting that my children had turned to theft because I had been unwilling to help them voluntarily. It was a complete fabrication, but it was designed to plant doubt in the minds of the jurors about my character and my relationship with Lisa and Robert. The cross-examination continued for hours, with Brennan questioning everything from my mental health to my parenting skills to my understanding of modern banking procedures. By the time he was finished, I felt like I had been flayed alive. But Jennifer Walsh's redirect examination gave me the chance to set the record straight. Mrs. Coleman, Mr. Brennan asked you about helping your children financially. During the period when they were drugging and robbing you, how much money did they steal from your accounts? $47,000 that I've been able to document. And how much would you have been willing to give them if they had simply asked for help? I thought about that question, about the children I had loved unconditionally for decades, about the lengths I would have gone to help them if they had been honest with me. If Lisa and Robert had come to me and explained their financial problems, I would have helped them with whatever they needed. I would have given them the money freely rather than watch them struggle. So the issue wasn't your unwillingness to help your children financially? The issue was that they chose to destroy me instead of asking for my help. That was the heart of it, the detail that made their crimes so much more devastating than simple theft. They could have had my help, my support, my resources. All they had to do was ask. Instead, they chose to take everything by force, to reduce me to a victim, to erase my autonomy and dignity in pursuit of money I would have given them willingly. The trial revealed details about Lisa and Robert's lives that I had never known. The prosecution presented evidence of gambling debts, credit card fraud, and other financial crimes that painted a picture of two people spiraling out of control long before they turned their attention to me. Lisa had been embezzling from her employer for over a year, skimming money from client accounts to fund her gambling addiction. Robert had been involved in insurance fraud, filing false claims for injuries that never happened. They were career, Criminals who had simply expanded their operations to include elder abuse when their other schemes became too risky. Learning this should have made me feel better about pressing charges against them. They weren't desperate children who had made a terrible mistake. They were predators who had targeted me because they saw me as an easy victim. But somehow, knowing the full scope of their criminal behavior made everything worse. These weren't the children I had raised, but they weren't strangers either. They were people I had loved and shaped and influenced, people who had chosen to become monsters despite everything I had tried to teach them about right and wrong. The guilt was crushing. I replayed their childhoods obsessively, looking for signs I had missed, moments when I could have intervened, warnings I should have heeded. Had I been too permissive? Too strict? Had I failed to instill proper values? Had I somehow modeled the behavior that led them to see other people as objects to be exploited? The rational part of my mind knew that adults were responsible for their own choices, that I couldn't control who Lisa and Robert decided to become. But the mother in me kept searching for the moment when I had failed them so completely that they became capable of destroying me. Maria tried to help me work through these feelings, connecting me with a therapist who specialized in family trauma. Dr. Sarah Chen was a kind woman about my age who had seen dozens of cases like mine, elderly people betrayed by family members they had trusted and loved. Guilt is normal, she told me during one of our sessions. Every parent who discovers their child has committed serious crimes blames themselves. But you need to understand that you didn't make Lisa and Robert into thieves and abusers. They made those choices themselves. But I must have done something. Wrong, I insisted. Good parents don't raise children who become criminals. Sandra, good parents raise children who have the capacity to choose between right and wrong. What those children do with that capacity is up to them. You gave Lisa and Robert moral guidance, love, support, and education. They chose to ignore those gifts and pursue a path that hurt innocent people, including you. The therapy helped, but it couldn't erase the fundamental trauma of discovering that the people I loved most in the world had been willing to destroy me for money. Trust, once broken so completely, doesn't heal easily or completely. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for both Lisa and Robert. The evidence had been too overwhelming, their crimes too well documented, for any other outcome. But even in victory, I felt no satisfaction. Watching my children being led away in handcuffs after sentencing, knowing they would spend the next several years in prison, felt like watching them die. In a way, they had died. The Lisa and Robert I had loved were gone, replaced by these strangers who had seen me as nothing more than a source of income. The sentences were substantial. Lisa received 8 years for elder abuse, fraud, and embezzlement. Robert got 6 years for his role in the conspiracy. They would also have to pay full restitution for the money they had stolen, though Maria warned me that recovering those funds would be difficult given their other debts and legal obligations. But the money wasn't really the point anymore. Yes, point was establishing that elderly people weren't helpless victims, that families who preyed on vulnerable relatives would face serious consequences, that trust couldn't be weaponized without accountability. In the weeks following the sentencing, I received hundreds of letters from other elderly people who had experienced similar abuse. Some had been victimized by their children, others by grandchildren, siblings, or caregivers. All of them expressed gratitude that someone had been willing to fight back, to prove that age didn't make you powerless. One letter particularly moved me. It was from a woman named Dorothy Henderson in Minnesota, whose son had been stealing her Social Security checks for months. She had been afraid to report him because he was her only family, her only connection to the outside world. After reading about my case, she had found the courage to contact Adult Protective Services. "Your story showed me that being alone is better than being abused," she wrote. "Thank you for proving that we don't have to accept mistreatment just because it comes from family." That letter helped me understand something important about what had happened to me. My private nightmare had become a public story not for entertainment value, but because it gave other victims permission to fight back. By refusing to be a silent victim, I had accidentally become a voice for elderly people who thought they had no choice but to endure abuse from family members. The media attention gradually faded, but the impact of the case continued to ripple outward. Several states updated their elder abuse laws based on recommendations that emerged from the trial. Law enforcement agencies began training officers to recognize the signs of family financial exploitation. Banks implemented new protocols for monitoring unusual account activity by elderly customers. Most importantly, other elderly people began speaking up about abuse they were experiencing. Adult Protective Services reported a significant increase in reports of family financial exploitation in the months following my case. People who had been suffering in silence found the courage to seek help, but for me personally, the victory felt hollow. I had saved myself from complete destruction, but I had lost my family in the process. Lisa and Robert were in prison, but they were also strangers to me now. The people I had loved for decades no longer existed, replaced by criminals, who happened to share my DNA. The house felt different after everything was over. Rooms that had been filled with family memories now echoed with the ghosts of betrayal. The kitchen where I had cooked thousands of meals for my children was the same kitchen where they had systematically poisoned me. The dining room where we had celebrated birthdays and holidays was where I had finally confronted them with evidence of their crimes. I considered selling the house and moving somewhere without memories, starting fresh in a place where every corner didn't remind me of what I had lost. But eventually I decided to stay. This was my home, my sanctuary, the place Frank and I had built our life together. I wouldn't let Lisa and Robert's crimes drive me away from the space that held my real memories, the ones from before they became people I didn't recognize. Instead, I began the slow process of reclaiming my life and my home. I had new locks, installed, changed all my passwords and account numbers, and created new security systems to protect myself from any future attempts at exploitation. But more importantly, I started building new relationships and connections to replace the family bonds that had been severed. I became more involved in community organizations, volunteering with literacy programs and mentoring young teachers. I joined support groups for elder abuse survivors, sharing my experience with others who were struggling to rebuild their lives after family betrayal. I started speaking at conferences about financial exploitation, helping to educate professionals who worked with elderly clients. Slowly, carefully, I began to trust again. Not completely, and not easily, but enough to form new friendships and connections. I learned to see people as individuals rather than potential threats, to judge character based on actions rather than family relationships. The healing process was gradual and incomplete. Some days I felt strong and vindicated, proud of myself for fighting back against people who had underestimated my intelligence and determination. Other days I felt broken and lonely, mourning the loss of the children I had thought I knew and loved. But every day, I woke up in my own home, in control of my own life, making my own decisions about my future. I was Sandra Coleman again, not the victim Lisa and Robert had tried to create. And that was worth everything I had endured to get there. The scars would never completely heal, but they had made me stronger in ways I hadn't expected. I had learned that survival wasn't just about protecting yourself from strangers. Sometimes it meant protecting yourself from the people who were supposed to love you most. And I had learned that being elderly didn't make you powerless, that experience and intelligence were weapons that could be used against even the most calculating abusers. Most importantly, I had learned that family wasn't defined by blood, but by love, respect, and genuine care for each other's well-being. The people who had shared my DNA had proven they weren't really my family at all. But the community I was building around myself, the connections based on mutual respect and honest affection, those relationships were worth more than any biological bond. I was 74 years old, and I was just beginning to understand what it meant to be truly free. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, 6 months after the sentencing. I recognized Lisa's handwriting immediately, those careful loops and precise lines I had helped her practice when she was learning cursive in 3rd grade. My hands trembled as I held the envelope, debating whether to open it or throw it away, unopened. Prison had given my daughter time to think, apparently, and she wanted to talk. I sat at my kitchen table for 20 minutes, staring at that envelope, remembering the last time I had seen Lisa's face. She had looked at me with such hatred as they led her away in handcuffs, such pure resentment that her own mother had dared to fight back against her systematic destruction. The Lisa who had written this letter was supposedly the same person who had measured poison into my food while smiling and telling me how much she loved me. When I finally opened the envelope, the letter was 5 pages long, written in the careful script of someone who had taken time to choose each word deliberately. "Dear Mom," it began, and just seeing those words in her handwriting made my chest tighten with a mixture of grief and anger I still couldn't untangle. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand why. I know what Robert and I did was wrong, and I know saying sorry doesn't fix anything or take back the hurt we caused you. But I wanted you to know that I think about what we did every single day, and I'm trying to understand how we became the kind of people who could hurt you like that." The letter went on to describe her life in prison, her participation in counseling programs, her growing awareness of how addiction and financial desperation had warped her thinking. She wrote about taking responsibility for her actions, about understanding the magnitude of the betrayal she had committed against the woman who had raised her with love and sacrifice. But as I read her carefully crafted apologies and explanations, I found myself analyzing every word, searching for manipulation, for the subtle persuasion techniques she had used so effectively during the months she was poisoning me. Was this genuine remorse, or was this simply another performance designed to achieve a specific goal? "I don't expect you to forgive me," the letter continued. "I don't expect you to want a relationship with me ever again. But I wanted you to know that the mother who raised me is still in here somewhere, and she's ashamed of what I became. The values you taught me didn't disappear. I just chose to ignore them when things got hard. That's on me, not on you." Lisa wrote about her children, my grandchildren, who were now living with their father and his new wife. She worried about how the scandal had affected them, how they would understand what their mother had done when they were old enough to fully comprehend it. She asked if I would consider maintaining some kind of relationship with them, since they were innocent of her crimes and shouldn't be punished for her failures. That request hit me like a physical blow. I had been so focused on protecting myself from Lisa and Robert that I had pushed away everyone connected to them, including 2 children who had done nothing wrong except be born to a mother who had chosen to become a criminal. Emma was 14 now, a freshman in high school who had once spent every weekend at my house, helping me bake cookies and listening to stories about her mother's childhood. Jake was 11, a quiet boy who loved to read and had always curled up next to me on the couch while I read him chapter books that were slightly above his grade level. I hadn't spoken to either of them since their mother's arrest. Their father, Lisa's ex-husband David, had made it clear that he didn't want me in their lives anymore. He was protecting his children from the chaos and scandal surrounding their mother's crimes, and I couldn't blame him for that. But it meant I had lost my grandchildren along with my daughter, another devastating casualty of Lisa's choices. "I know David won't let you see Emma and Jake right now," Lisa wrote, "and I understand why. But someday when they're older, they might want to know their grandmother. I hope you'll be willing to talk to them then, to help them understand that you loved them even when you couldn't be part of their lives." The letter ended with a request that surprised me. Lisa asked if I would be willing to participate in a restorative justice program, a mediation process where victims and offenders could meet in a controlled environment to discuss the impact of crimes and work toward some kind of healing. I'm not asking you to forgive me or to pretend this didn't happen, she wrote. But maybe talking face to face would help both of us understand how we got to this place. Maybe it would help me figure out how to live with what I've done. And maybe it would help you get some kind of closure. I set the letter aside and walked out into my garden, needing fresh air and space to think. The autumn flowers were in full bloom. The mums and asters I had planted in the spring when I was still living in the fog of my children's drugs. These plants had survived the chaos of the past year, had continued to grow and flourish even as my world fell apart around me. The idea of meeting with Lisa face to face terrified me. I had worked so hard to rebuild my sense of safety and autonomy, to create a life where I was in control of my environment and relationships. Sitting across from her, even in a supervised setting, felt like voluntarily walking back into the nightmare. I had fought so hard to escape. But there were things I wanted to say to her, questions I wanted answered, conversations that had been interrupted by lawyers and courtrooms and the formal language of legal proceedings. Despite everything she had done to me, she was still the little girl who had brought me dandelion bouquets and the teenager who had cried on my shoulder when her first boyfriend broke her heart. I called Maria to discuss the restorative justice option. She was cautious but not opposed to the idea. These programs can be helpful for both victims and offenders, she explained, but only if you're doing it for your own healing, not because you feel obligated or because you hope to repair the relationship. Lisa is going to be in prison for several more years, and there's no guarantee she'll be a different person when she gets out. Maria was right to be cautious. I had to examine my motivations carefully, to make sure I wasn't being drawn into another manipulation or setting myself up for further disappointment. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there were things I needed to say to Lisa, not for her benefit, but for mine. I needed to look her in the eye and tell her how her betrayal had affected me, not just financially, but emotionally and spiritually. I needed to make sure she understood the full scope of what she had taken from me. And perhaps most importantly, I needed to see who she really was now, without the performance of the courtroom or the careful language of a written letter. I needed to know if the remorse she expressed was genuine or if she was still the master manipulator who had spent months slowly poisoning me while playing the role of the concerned daughter. The restorative justice meeting was scheduled for a cold December morning at the Women's Correctional Facility where Lisa was serving her sentence. The mediator, a woman named Dr. Rebecca Martinez, met with me beforehand to prepare me for what to expect and to establish ground rules for the conversation. This isn't about reconciliation, Dr. Martinez explained. This is about communication and understanding. You're under no obligation to forgive Lisa or to rebuild a relationship with her. Your only obligation is to be honest about your experience and to listen to what she has to say. The meeting room was stark and institutional, with fluorescent lighting and gray walls that seemed designed to drain all warmth from human interaction. When Lisa walked in wearing prison-issued clothing, her hair shorter and her face thinner than I remembered, I was struck by how small she looked. This woman who had loomed so large in my nightmares, who had systematically dismantled my life, looked fragile and diminished. But then she met my eyes, and I saw something there that reminded me why I had been afraid to come. Intelligence, calculation, the same quick mind that had planned and executed my destruction. Prison might have changed her circumstances, but I wasn't convinced it had changed her fundamental nature. "Hello, Mom," she said quietly, and hearing her voice again after so many months was like being transported back to those terrible days when I had lived in constant fear and confusion. We sat across from each other at a small table, with Dr. Martinez positioned to mediate if the conversation became too heated or emotional. The silence stretched between us, filled with months of anger and pain, and questions that couldn't be easily answered. "Thank you for coming," Lisa finally said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either," I replied. "I'm still not sure why I'm here." Lisa nodded, accepting that honesty. I wanted to try to explain if you're willing to listen. Not to excuse what I did, but to help you understand how I got to the place where I could hurt you like that. So she began to tell me her story, starting with the financial pressures that had built up over years of poor decisions and bad luck. The gambling addiction that had started small and spiraled out of control. The embezzlement from her employer that had begun as a temporary loan she intended to pay back. The mounting debts and the panic of watching her life fall apart while trying to maintain a facade of stability for her children. I told myself at first that borrowing from your accounts was just temporary, she said. I was going to pay it back before you noticed. But then I realized how easy it was to forge your signature, how much money you had just sitting there, and it became easier to take more rather than find a way to pay back what I'd already stolen. She described the decision to start drugging me as a practical matter, a way to ensure I wouldn't interfere with their activities or question the missing money. She talked about researching sedatives online, about calculating dosages that would keep me compliant without immediately killing me. The clinical way she described poisoning me was almost more disturbing than the act itself. She spoke about it like a business decision, a problem that required a technical solution. There was no emotion in her voice as she described measuring drugs into my food, no recognition of the monstrous nature of what she was doing. Did you ever think about what you were doing to me as a person? I asked. Did you ever consider that you were erasing me, taking away my ability to think and choose and remember? Lisa was quiet for a long time before answering. I couldn't let myself think about that, she finally said. I had to focus on the money, on solving our financial problems. If I thought about what it was doing to you as a person, I wouldn't have been able to continue. That admission was somehow both more and less than I had hoped for. She was acknowledging the deliberate nature of her choice to dehumanize me, to reduce me to an obstacle rather than a person. But she was also revealing the depth of her selfishness, her willingness to sacrifice my humanity for her convenience. Do you understand what you took from me? I asked. It wasn't just money. You took my sense of reality, my trust in my own mind, my ability to feel safe in my own home. You made me question everything I thought I knew about myself and my family. I know, she said, and for the first time, her voice cracked with emotion. I know I destroyed more than just your bank account. I destroyed your faith in the people who were supposed to love you most. We talked for 2 hours, covering everything from the specific mechanics of their crimes to the broader questions of how a family could reach such a point of dysfunction. Lisa answered my questions honestly, even when the answers revealed the calculation and cruelty behind her actions. But as the conversation continued, I began to realize that the person sitting across from me wasn't quite the Lisa I remembered, or the monster I had imagined. She was something more complex and more troubling. A human being who had made a series of choices that led her further and further away from the values she had been raised with. She wasn't evil in some cartoonish way. She was someone who had allowed circumstances and poor judgment to gradually erode her moral boundaries until she was capable of systematically abusing her own mother. In some ways, that was more frightening than pure evil would have been. What do you want from me now? I asked near the end of our time together. Nothing, she said, and I believed her. I don't expect forgiveness or reconciliation or a relationship. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I did was unforgivable, and I wanted to take full responsibility for it. As I prepared to leave, Lisa asked one final question. Do you think there's any chance that Emma and Jake will be able to forgive me someday? The pain in her voice when she mentioned her children was the first emotion that seemed completely genuine and unguarded. Whatever else she had become, she was still a mother who loved her children and was devastated by the impact her crimes had had on their lives. I don't know, I told her honestly. That's up to them to decide when they're old enough to understand everything that happened. Driving home from the prison, I felt emotionally drained but somehow lighter. The conversation hadn't provided the closure I had hoped for, but it had given me something almost as valuable: clarity. I now understood exactly who Lisa was and what she was capable of. I could stop wondering about her motivations or tormenting myself with questions about whether I had misunderstood her actions. She was exactly who I thought she was: someone who had chosen convenience over conscience, money over morality, selfishness over family loyalty. But she was also someone who was capable of recognizing the magnitude of her failures, even if that recognition came too late to matter. In the months that followed our meeting, I received occasional letters from Lisa updating me on her prison, programs, and her ongoing therapy. I read them but didn't respond. Our conversation had been necessary for my healing, but it hadn't restored trust or affection. She was still a stranger who happened to share my genetics, someone whose choices had placed her permanently outside the circle of people I could love and trust. Robert never reached out to me at all. According to Maria, he had shown no interest in restorative justice programs or accepting responsibility for his actions. He blamed Lisa for leading him into criminal activity, blamed me for pressing charges, blamed the legal system for treating them unfairly. He remained convinced that he was the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of his own downfall. The difference in their responses to imprisonment revealed something important about their characters. Lisa, whatever her flaws, was capable of self-reflection and growth. Robert remained locked in the narcissistic thinking that had enabled him to participate in my abuse without questioning the morality of his actions. I knew that when they were eventually released from prison, I would need to be prepared for the possibility that they might try to contact me or manipulate other people into pressuring me to reconcile with them. But I also knew that I had the strength and support systems to maintain my boundaries, whatever they chose to do. The experience of meeting with Lisa had taught me something important about forgiveness and healing. I didn't need to forgive my children to move forward with my life. I didn't need to understand them completely or to believe in their redemption. I just needed to accept the reality of who they were and make peace with the fact that they would never be the people I had hoped they would become. That acceptance was liberating in ways I hadn't expected. For months after the trial, I had carried the weight of trying to understand how my children had become capable of such cruelty. I had tortured myself with questions about my failures as a parent, my missed opportunities to intervene, my responsibility for their moral collapse. But my conversation with Lisa had made it clear that her choices were her own, driven by character flaws and decision-making patterns that were independent of anything I had done or failed to do as her mother. I could stop carrying guilt that belonged to her, stop trying to solve puzzles that weren't mine to solve. The holidays that year were the first I had spent completely alone since Frank died, but they were also the most peaceful I had experienced in years. I decorated my house the way I wanted to, cooked the foods I enjoyed, and spent time with friends who brought joy rather than drama into my life. On Christmas morning, I received a card from Emma and Jake, my grandchildren. It was simple, just a store-bought card with their names signed inside, but it meant everything to me. David had apparently decided that the children were old enough to maintain some contact with me, independent of their mother's crimes. I wrote them back immediately, telling them how much I missed them and how proud I was of their strength during such a difficult time. I didn't mention their mother or the legal proceedings, focusing instead on their accomplishments in school and their interests and hobbies. It wasn't the grandmother relationship I had once envisioned, but it was a connection that honored their innocence while protecting my own emotional well-being. Perhaps someday, when they were adults and could understand the full complexity of what had happened, we could build something stronger. As the first anniversary of Lisa and Robert's arrests approached, I found myself reflecting on how much my life had changed. I was no longer the trusting mother who had believed family loyalty was absolute and unconditional. But I was also no longer the confused, frightened victim who had nearly lost everything to people who were supposed to protect me. I had become someone new, a woman who understood that love without boundaries was dangerous, that trust had to be earned rather than assumed, and that survival sometimes required making choices that felt impossible. The scars from my children's betrayal would always be with me, but they had also made me stronger and more discerning. I had learned to value relationships based on respect and genuine affection rather than obligation and blood ties. I had discovered that family could be chosen as well as inherited, and that sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones you need to love from the greatest distance. Most importantly, I had proven to myself that age and vulnerability didn't equal powerlessness. When faced with systematic abuse by people who thought they could control and exploit me, I had found the strength to fight back, to gather evidence, to build a case, and to see justice done. That knowledge would stay with me for whatever years I had left, a reminder that Sandra Coleman was someone who could not be easily defeated, even by the people who thought they knew her best. 3 years had passed since that December morning, when I sat across from Lisa in that sterile prison meeting room. 3 years of rebuilding, of learning to trust again, of discovering who Sandra Coleman was when she wasn't defined by being someone's mother or victim or cautionary tale. The woman who looked back at me in the mirror each morning was someone I was still getting to know. She had silver hair that caught the light differently now, laugh lines that had deepened from genuine joy rather than polite social smiles, and eyes that held both wisdom and wariness in equal measure. At 77, I was living the most authentic life I had ever known. My routine had evolved into something that brought me deep satisfaction. Morning coffee on the back porch while watching the birds at the feeders Frank had installed decades ago. Tending the garden that had become my sanctuary, where I grew vegetables for the local food bank and flowers that bloomed in defiant beauty, regardless of the storms that might rage around them. Afternoons spent volunteering at the literacy center, where I helped adults learn to read with the same patience I had once brought to my 5th grade classroom. But it was the evenings that held the most meaning now. 3 nights a week, my living room transformed into a support group meeting place for elderly people who had experienced financial abuse by family members. We called ourselves the Phoenix Circle because we had all risen from the ashes of betrayal to build new lives. Margaret Howell, my old teaching colleague, had been the first to join me. Her nephew had been stealing her pension checks for 2 years before she found the courage to report him. There was Dorothy Chen, whose daughter had maxed out credit cards in her name to fund a drug addiction. James Patterson, a retired mechanic whose son had convinced him to sign over his house and then tried to have him declared incompetent when he changed his mind. Each story was different in its details, but identical in its core. Trusted family members who had seen elderly relatives as opportunities rather than people worthy of respect and protection. The hardest part isn't the money, Dorothy often said during our meetings. It's realizing that the person you raised, the child you would have died for, sees you as nothing more than a bank account with a heartbeat. Our meetings weren't therapy sessions, though healing happened there. They were practical workshops, where we shared information about legal protections, financial safeguards, and warning signs that others might miss. We had created a network of people who understood that surviving family betrayal required both emotional resilience and practical preparation. Maria Santos had become more than my attorney. She was now a friend who stopped by regularly to check on my well-being and to consult with our group about new developments in elder protection laws. The legislation that had emerged from my case was being replicated in other states, creating stronger penalties for financial exploitation and better training for law enforcement officers who encountered these crimes. You started something important, Maria told me one evening as our Phoenix Circle meeting was winding down. The ripple effects of your courage to fight back are still spreading, but the most significant development in my new life had nothing to do with legal victories or support groups. It had to do with a phone call I received on a rainy Thursday afternoon in April. "Grandma Sandy, this is Emma." My granddaughter's voice was different than I remembered, deeper and more confident, but unmistakably hers. She was 17 now, a senior in high school, and she was calling me for the first time since her mother's arrest. "Emma, sweetheart," I managed, my voice catching with emotion I had thought I had processed completely. "How are you, darling?" "I'm good," she said, and I could hear both nervousness and determination in her tone. "I wanted to call because I'm graduating next month, and I've been thinking a lot about family and what that means." We talked for an hour, a conversation that meandered through her academic achievements, her college plans, her complicated feelings about having a mother in prison, and her memories of the time we had spent together before everything fell apart. "I know, Mom, did terrible things to you," she said near the end of our call. "Dad explained everything when I turned 16 and started asking more questions. I can't defend what she did, and I understand why you had to press charges." "But?" I asked, sensing there was more she wanted to say. "But you're still my grandmother, and you didn't do anything wrong. I miss you, and I've missed having you in my life. I was wondering if maybe we could start talking again, if you're open to that." The tears that fell were different from any I had shed during the past 3 years. These weren't tears of grief or anger or loss. These were tears of unexpected joy, of a connection I had thought was severed forever suddenly being offered back to me. Emma and I began talking regularly after that. Video calls where I could see how much she had grown and changed, letters where she shared her thoughts about her future and her past. She was studying to become a social worker, inspired partly by her own family's dysfunction and her desire to help other families navigate crisis and trauma. "I want to work with elderly people," she told me during one of our conversations. "I want to help protect them from the kind of thing that happened to you." Jake, now 14, was slower to reach out, but eventually he too began calling occasionally. Our conversations were shorter and more tentative, but they held the promise of a relationship that could grow stronger over time. Their father, David, had remarried a woman named Sarah, who encouraged the children to reconnect with me. She understood that I was not responsible for their mother's crimes, and that cutting me out of their lives only added to the casualties of Lisa's choices. "Your grandchildren need to know they come from strength," Sarah told me during a phone conversation. "They need to see that it's possible to survive betrayal and build something good from the wreckage." The relationship I was building with Emma and Jake was different from the one I had enjoyed with them as small children. It was more cautious, more intentional, built on honest communication rather than assumed family loyalty. But it was also deeper in some ways, grounded in choice rather than obligation. They knew exactly who I was and what I had endured. They had chosen to love me anyway, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. That choice meant everything, to me. As Emma's graduation approached, she asked if I would attend the ceremony. It would be the first time I had been in the same space as David since the trial. The first time I would be part of a family celebration since everything had fallen apart. "I understand if it would be too difficult," she said when I hesitated. "But it would mean a lot to me to have you there." I bought a new dress for the occasion, something bright and celebratory that reflected the joy I felt in Emma's accomplishments rather than the grief that had defined so much of my recent history. As I sat in the auditorium watching my granddaughter walk across the stage to receive her diploma, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge or justice. This was what survival looked like, not just enduring the betrayal and fighting back against the perpetrators, but rebuilding connections that honored the innocent while protecting the vulnerable. It was possible to love selectively, to maintain boundaries while remaining open to unexpected grace. After the ceremony, David approached me with an expression I couldn't read. "Sandra," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. It means a lot to Emma." "Thank you for encouraging her to reach out to me," I replied. "I know the situation has been complicated for your family." "The situation was complicated by Lisa's choices," he said firmly. "You did what you had to do to protect yourself. I respect that, and I want the kids to understand that standing up for yourself isn't something to be ashamed of. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was acknowledgement and respect. It was enough to build on. That summer, Emma came to stay with me for a week before starting college. It was the first time in years that my house had hosted someone, under the age of 60, and her presence brought an energy I had forgotten I missed. We cooked together, gardened together, and talked about everything from her college plans to her complicated feelings about her mother. She helped me organize old photo albums, laughing at pictures of her mother and uncle as children, trying to reconcile those innocent faces with the people they had become. "Do you think Mom will ever really change?" she asked one evening as we sat on the porch watching the sunset. It was a question I had pondered countless times, especially after my conversation with Lisa in prison. I wanted to give Emma hope, but I also needed to be honest about the realities of her mother's character and choices. "I think your mother is capable of understanding what she did wrong," I said carefully. "I think she genuinely regrets the pain she caused, but understanding and regret don't automatically translate into fundamental change. People can modify their behavior, especially with help and accountability, but changing the core patterns that led to the behavior is much harder." "So you don't think she'll be a different person when she gets out?" "I think she'll be a person who has learned some hard lessons and faced some serious consequences. Whether that makes her someone you can trust again is something you'll have to decide for yourself when the time comes." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "I love her because she's my mom, but I don't have to like who she is or what she did." "That's exactly right," I told her. "Love doesn't require blindness or excuse-making. The healthiest love includes clear boundaries and honest assessment of character." It was a lesson I had learned too late in my own relationship with Lisa and Robert, but one I was grateful Emma was learning early. As autumn approached and Emma left for college, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed since that terrible spring when my world had been turned upside down. The house felt quiet again, but it was a peaceful quiet rather than the oppressive silence of isolation and confusion. I had built a life that was fuller and more meaningful than the one I had lived before my children's betrayal. My relationships were chosen rather than inherited, based on mutual respect rather than biological obligation. My days were filled with purpose and connection rather than routine and dependency. The Phoenix Circle had grown to include 23 members, and we had started offering educational workshops to the broader community about financial exploitation and elder abuse. I had become a spokesperson for elderly rights, speaking at conferences and working with legislators to strengthen protective laws. Most importantly, I had learned that being 77 years old didn't mean being powerless or invisible. Age had brought me clarity about what mattered, courage to defend my boundaries, and wisdom to distinguish between people who deserved my trust and those who merely demanded it. The anniversary of Lisa and Robert's arrests came and went without the emotional upheaval that had marked previous years. Their crimes were part of my history now, but they no longer defined my present or limited my future. I received an update from Maria that Robert would be eligible for parole in 6 months. He had completed his sentence with minimal participation in rehabilitation programs and had made no effort to acknowledge responsibility for his actions or make amends to his victims. When released, he would likely face years of financial obligations to repay the money he had stolen, but he would be free to resume his life. Lisa had embraced prison programs more fully, earning her GED and completing training as a paralegal. She had been a model prisoner and would likely be released within 2 years. Her letters to me had stopped after our meeting, but according to Emma, she wrote to her children regularly and was working with a therapist to understand the choices that had led to her incarceration. I felt no particular emotion about either of their upcoming releases. They were adults who would face the consequences of their actions and make their own choices about how to live their remaining years. Their decisions were no longer my responsibility, or my concern. What mattered to me was the life I had built in the aftermath of their betrayal. I was surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide for them. I had financial security because I had learned to protect my assets and make informed decisions about my resources. I had purpose because I had found ways to use my experience to help others avoid similar victimization. Most importantly, I had peace. Not the peace of forgetting or pretending the betrayal hadn't happened, but the peace of having survived it and emerged stronger. I had faced the worst that family dysfunction could inflict and discovered that I was resilient enough to not just endure it, but to transform it into something meaningful. On Christmas morning of that year, I hosted dinner for the Phoenix Circle and their chosen families. My dining room table, which had once been the scene of my final confrontation with Lisa and Robert, was filled with laughter and genuine warmth. We were a collection of people who had been broken by betrayal and had chosen to heal together. Margaret brought her famous apple pie. Dorothy contributed homemade bread. James arrived with flowers from his garden and stories about his grandchildren who had remained loyal to him throughout his ordeal with his son. Maria came with her husband and teenage daughter, treating us all like the extended family we had become. As I looked around the table at these faces, some lined with age and others brightened by youth, I realized that this was what redemption looked like. Not the restoration of what had been lost, but the creation of something new and beautiful from the fragments that remained. The little girl who had once believed that family meant unconditional love and automatic trust was gone forever. In her place was a woman who understood that the most meaningful relationships were built on choice, respect, and genuine affection. She had learned that survival wasn't just about enduring tragedy, but about using that experience to create a life of deeper authenticity and purpose. At 77, Sandra Coleman was finally living the life she was meant to live, surrounded by people who chose to love her and whom she chose to love in return. It wasn't the life she had once imagined, but it was better than anything she could have planned. As the evening wound down and my guests prepared to leave, Emma called from college to wish everyone a Merry Christmas. I put her on speaker so she could talk to the group, and her voice filled the room with youthful energy and hope. "Thank you all for taking care of my grandmother," she said. "She deserves to be surrounded by people who appreciate how amazing she is." After everyone had gone home and I was alone in my clean kitchen, washing the last of the dishes, I thought about that phrase. People who appreciate how amazing she is. It struck me that for most of my life, I had been so focused on taking care of others, on being the person they needed me to be, that I had never really considered whether I was amazing in my own right. But I was amazing. I had raised 2 children, even if they had ultimately chosen paths I couldn't follow. I had been a teacher who influenced hundreds of young minds. I had been a wife who loved deeply and was deeply loved in return. I had been a mother-in-law, a grandmother, a friend, a neighbor, a community member. And when the people I trusted most had tried to destroy me, I had refused to be destroyed. I had fought back with intelligence and determination. I had gathered evidence, built a case, and seen justice done. I had survived their attempts to erase me and had instead erased their power over me. Most importantly, I had taken the worst experience of my life and transformed it into a source of strength and purpose. I had used my pain to prevent others from suffering similar betrayal. I had turned my isolation into connection, my vulnerability into wisdom, my fear into courage. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I felt grateful for everything that had brought me to this moment. Even the betrayal, even the months of confusion and fear, even the painful realization that my children were not the people I had believed them to be. All of it had led me here, to this life of chosen family and meaningful purpose, to this understanding of my own strength and worth, to this peace that came from knowing exactly who I was and what I stood for. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. There would be more Phoenix Circle meetings, more chances to help elderly people protect themselves from exploitation, more conversations with Emma and Jake as they continued to build their lives. There would be garden work and volunteer obligations and quiet evenings reading books that fed my soul. There would be a life lived on my own terms, surrounded by people who had earned the right to be part of it, filled with purpose that emerged from my own experiences and choices. It was a good life. It was my life, and I had earned every moment of peace and joy it contained. As I sit here today, 5 years removed from the nightmare that nearly consumed my life, I find myself contemplating the profound lessons that emerged from one of the darkest chapters any parent could imagine. The story of how my own children systematically drugged and robbed me is more than just a cautionary tale about elder abuse. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of choosing survival over surrender. When I first realized what Lisa and Robert were doing to me, my instinct was to retreat into denial. The alternative was too devastating to contemplate. How could the babies I had nursed, the toddlers I had taught to walk, the teenagers I had worried about and supported through every crisis, become the architects of my destruction? The cognitive dissonance was so severe that for weeks I questioned my own sanity rather than accept the evidence before my eyes. But denial, I learned, is a luxury that victims cannot afford. The moment I chose to trust my own perceptions over my desperate need to believe in my children's goodness was the moment I began to reclaim my life. This realization strikes at the heart of one of the most insidious aspects of family abuse, the way it weaponizes our deepest bonds against us. Strangers who abuse elderly people are easier to identify and defend against. We expect danger from unknown predators. We install security systems, avoid dark alleys, and trust our instincts when something feels wrong. But when the predator shares your DNA, when they know your favorite foods and your childhood stories, when they can perfectly mimic love and concern while systematically destroying you, the very foundations of trust and safety crumble. Lisa and Robert didn't just steal money from me. They stole my faith in my own judgment, my belief in family loyalty, my sense of safety in my own home. They forced me to question every relationship, every gesture of kindness, every expression of love I had ever received or given. The psychological damage was exponentially more devastating than the financial theft. Yet it was precisely this complete breakdown of my assumptions about family and trust that ultimately liberated me. When everything I had believed about unconditional love and biological bonds was stripped away, I was forced to rebuild my understanding of relationships from the ground up. This reconstruction, painful as it was, allowed me to create something stronger and more authentic than what I had lost. The months I spent pretending to be their victim while secretly gathering evidence taught me something crucial about the relationship between vulnerability and power. Society trains us to see aging as a process of diminishing capacity, increasing dependence, and gradual irrelevance. My children had internalized these ageist assumptions and believed that my advanced years made me an easy target for manipulation and abuse. They were catastrophically wrong. The skills I had developed over 7 decades of life, the wisdom accumulated through years of teaching and parenting, the strategic thinking honed by managing classrooms and households, all of these assets remained intact even when my children were drugging me into confusion. When I finally understood what was happening, I was able to deploy those skills with devastating effectiveness. The irony is profound. Lisa and Robert thought they were exploiting my weakness, but they had actually awakened my greatest strengths. They had underestimated not just my intelligence and determination, but the particular kind of moral clarity that comes with having nothing left to lose. This experience taught me that vulnerability and power are not mutually exclusive. In fact, the most profound power sometimes emerges from the depths of vulnerability. When I was at my most physically and emotionally compromised, when I was isolated and confused and afraid, I found resources within myself that I never knew existed. The decision to fight back was not just about seeking justice for myself, it was about refusing to accept society's narrative about elderly people as helpless victims. Every time an elderly person is abused and remains silent, whether out of shame or fear or misplaced loyalty, the message is reinforced that such abuse is acceptable. By standing up and speaking out, I was challenging not just my individual abusers, but an entire system that enables the exploitation of vulnerable adults. The legal proceedings revealed the extent to which elder abuse has become a hidden epidemic. My case was not unique or unusual. It was part of a vast pattern of family members targeting elderly relatives for financial exploitation. The prosecutors told me that such crimes are vastly underreported, partly because victims are reluctant to expose family members and partly because the signs of abuse are often mistaken for natural cognitive decline. This underreporting serves the interests of abusers who count on their victims' silence. They exploit not just financial assets but emotional bonds, using love and loyalty as weapons against the people who trust them most. The shame and stigma surrounding family abuse creates a protective shield for perpetrators who understand that their victims would rather suffer in silence than expose their children or grandchildren to criminal prosecution. Breaking that silence was one of the most difficult decisions I ever made, but it was also one of the most important. By refusing to protect Lisa and Robert from the consequences of their actions, I was protecting other potential victims. The ripple effects of speaking out extended far beyond my personal situation. The media attention, uncomfortable as it was, served a vital purpose. It showed other elderly people that they had options beyond suffering in silence. It demonstrated that age does not disqualify someone from seeking justice. It proved that abusers, even family members, could be held accountable for their crimes. Most importantly, it challenged the narrative that elderly people should be grateful for any attention from family members, even when that attention comes with a price. The expectation that older adults should accept mistreatment rather than risk losing family connections is a form of emotional blackmail that enables abuse. My story demonstrated that some connections are too toxic to preserve, regardless of biological relationships. The journey from victim to survivor to advocate has been transformative in ways I could never have anticipated. The Phoenix Circle, the support group I helped create for elderly abuse survivors, has become one of the most meaningful aspects of my life. Watching other people find their strength and reclaim their power has shown me that healing is not just possible, but inevitable when people refuse to accept victimhood as their permanent identity. Each member of our group has a different story, but all of them share the common experience of being betrayed by people they trusted. The shame and isolation that initially defined their experiences gradually transforms into strength and connection. They discover that they are not alone, not powerless, and not responsible for other people's moral failures. The process of healing from family betrayal is complex and nonlinear. There are moments of rage, periods of grief, episodes of doubt and self-recrimination. The temptation to minimize the abuse or excuse the abusers is constant, especially when well-meaning people suggest that family reconciliation should be the ultimate goal. But I have learned that forgiveness is not a requirement for healing, and reconciliation is not always appropriate or safe. Some bridges are meant to be burned, especially when crossing them again would expose you to further harm. The pressure to forgive and forget serves the interests of abusers more than victims. This doesn't mean carrying hatred or bitterness forever. It means accepting reality without sugarcoating it, setting boundaries based on behavior rather than biology, and refusing to sacrifice your safety for other people's comfort with family dysfunction. My relationship with my grandchildren has taught me that it's possible to love selectively within families, to maintain connections with innocent parties while protecting yourself from those who have proven themselves dangerous. Emma and Jake are not responsible for their mother's crimes, and they should not be punished for her choices. But they also needed to understand that loving someone doesn't mean accepting their behavior or enabling their dysfunction. The conversations I've had with Emma and Jake about their mother have been some of the most important of my life. I've tried to help them understand that they can love Lisa while also recognizing her capacity for harm. They can feel sad about her imprisonment, while also understanding that it was necessary for justice and public safety. These nuanced emotional positions are difficult for anyone to navigate, but they're especially challenging for young people who have been taught that family loyalty requires blind support. Teaching them that love can coexist with boundaries, that protection of self is not betrayal of others, has been one of my greatest gifts to them. The financial recovery from the theft has been partial at best. While the court ordered full restitution, the reality is that people who steal from elderly relatives are rarely in a position to repay their victims. Lisa and Robert had spent most of my money before they were caught, and their prison sentences have prevented them from earning income to make amends. But the financial loss, devastating as it was, pales in comparison to what I gained through the process of fighting back. I discovered reserves of strength I didn't know I possessed. I developed new relationships based on mutual respect rather than biological obligation. I found purpose in helping others avoid the victimization I had experienced. Most importantly, I learned to value myself not as someone's mother or grandmother or caregiver, but as Sandra Coleman, an individual worthy of respect and protection. For most of my life, my identity had been defined by my relationships to other people. The betrayal by my children forced me to discover who I was when those relationships were stripped away. The woman I found underneath all those roles was someone I genuinely liked and admired. She was intelligent, resourceful, courageous, and principled. She was someone who deserved better than what Lisa and Robert had given her. Someone worthy of love and loyalty and honesty. This self-discovery was perhaps the most valuable outcome of an otherwise terrible experience. I had spent decades putting other people's needs before my own, assuming that self-sacrifice was synonymous with virtue. The abuse forced me to prioritize my own well-being and to recognize that self-preservation is not selfishness. The perspective that comes with having survived family betrayal has fundamentally changed how I view relationships and trust. I no longer assume that people who claim to love me have my best interests at heart. I pay attention to actions rather than words, patterns rather than promises. I trust incrementally and conditionally rather than absolutely and permanently. This might sound cynical, but it's actually liberating. When you stop expecting perfection from people and start evaluating them based on their actual behavior, you can form more authentic connections. You can appreciate people for who they really are, rather than who you wish they were or who they pretend to be. The elderly people in my support group often struggle with this transition from unconditional trust to conditional acceptance. They feel guilty for questioning their family members' motives or for setting boundaries around their resources. Society has taught them that suspicion of family is pathological rather than protective. But I have learned that healthy skepticism is not cynicism, it's wisdom. The ability to distinguish between people who deserve your trust and those who are simply demanding it is one of the most important skills anyone can develop, especially as they age and become more vulnerable to exploitation. The changes in elder protection laws that emerge from my case represent progress, but they are just the beginning of what needs to happen. The legal system is still struggling to understand the complexity of family financial abuse and the unique challenges faced by elderly victims. Too often, prosecutors and judges see these cases as family disputes rather than serious crimes. The banking industry has made some improvements in identifying unusual account activity, but much more needs to be done to protect elderly customers from financial exploitation. Healthcare providers need better training to recognize the signs of abuse and to understand their obligations to report suspected crimes. Most importantly, society needs to change its attitudes about aging and autonomy. The assumption that elderly people are inevitably declining in capacity makes them targets for abuse and prevents them from being taken seriously when they report crimes. Ageism is not just prejudice, It's a form of structural violence that enables exploitation. The work I do now with Phoenix Circle and in my advocacy efforts is focused on changing these attitudes and systems. Every time we help an elderly person recognize and report abuse, every time we educate professionals about elder protection, every time we challenge ageist assumptions about capacity and worth, we make the world a little safer for vulnerable adults. But the most important lesson from my experience is that individual strength and determination can overcome even the most sophisticated abuse. When Lisa and Robert began their campaign against me, they had every advantage. They knew my routines, my finances, my vulnerabilities. They had access to my home, my food, my daily life. They could monitor my activities and manipulate my environment with ease. Yet despite all these advantages, they ultimately failed because they underestimated the one thing they couldn't control: my refusal to accept victimhood as a permanent condition. When I finally understood what was happening, I was able to turn their advantages into disadvantages, their access into evidence, their confidence into carelessness. This is the message I want every elderly person to understand. You are not powerless, even when you feel most vulnerable. Your age is not a disqualification from justice. Your family relationships do not obligate you to accept abuse. Your desire for peace does not require you to submit to exploitation. You have the right to safety, dignity, and autonomy regardless of your age or your relationship to your abusers. You have the right to protect your resources, your health, and your well-being from anyone who would harm you, including family members. You have the right to speak up, fight back, and seek justice when you have been wronged. These rights are not theoretical or conditional. They are absolute and actionable. The systems and people exist to help you exercise them. But first, you must recognize that you deserve protection and support. The Sandra Coleman who emerged from this ordeal is not the same woman who was slowly being poisoned and robbed 3 years ago. She is stronger, wiser, more discerning, and more authentically herself than she has ever been. She is surrounded by people who chose to love her rather than people who felt obligated to tolerate her. She is engaged in work that gives her life meaning and purpose beyond her roles as caregiver and supporter of others. She is, in every meaningful sense, free. Free from toxic relationships, free from false obligations, free from the fear that speaking truth will destroy the connections that matter, free to live according to her own values rather than other people's expectations. This freedom came at a tremendous cost, but it was worth every moment of pain and fear and loss. Because on the other side of that nightmare was a life more authentic and fulfilling than anything I had imagined possible. To anyone reading this who recognizes themselves in my story, who suspects they are being abused or exploited by family, members who feels trapped by loyalty and love and obligation, you are not alone, you are not powerless, and you deserve better. The path forward is difficult and sometimes lonely, but it leads to a place of strength and peace that is worth every step of the journey. Trust yourself, protect yourself, and never let anyone convince you that your safety and dignity are less important than their comfort or convenience. You are worth fighting for, even when the fight is against people you love, especially then. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.